Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. I am your host, Brian. Glad to see y'all joining me today. Today we are going to be joined by my special guest, Ben Kissling, who has got a podcast called I can't ever remember the name of it for some reason. What was it? Fano? Well, he says it in the video, so you can watch it then. I'm also going to have that podcast linked in the description box below, and I will also have it, or the Ben's um, uh, critique of William Lane Craig's book, also in the description box below, which this is what today is about. We're going to be responding to William Lane Craig. We have another video on this channel early on in the Genesis series, also responding to William Lane Craig by Simon Turpin. This is going to offer another unique experience, but this time from someone different and someone who's been thinking about this subject matter for the past 5 years. So it'll be interesting discussion with him, and I can't wait. Me and him have some differences on responding to Bill Craig's book, but for the most part, I really liked a lot of his responses, and I thought he did a really good job at responding to Bill Craig and critiquing his arguments. He's been to classes that Bill Craig has taught. He has watched pretty much everything and read just about everything that Bill Craig has produced on this particular subject matter. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to Apologetics 101. I'm here today with my guest, Ben Kissling, do you have a ministry or I know you have a podcast. I'll link that in
Uh,
the description box
yeah,
below.
that's about all that I'm doing right now is the podcast. I mean, I do have like a YouTube channel where I kind of have like a couple of videos on there, and I do have some playlists of some previous videos that I did on this topic and a few others, but it's not something that I really make a lot of content on. My main thing is the podcast right now.
Right. What's your podcast called again?
Macrophage strategy.
Macrophage strategy.
Macrophage, the part of the immune system.
What's it about? Is it like an apologetics podcast?
It's mostly focused on young Earth creationism.
Okay, awesome. I'm thinking you have some stuff on there probably about William Lane Craig as well, in terms of responding to him.
Yeah, there's a hour and a half episode that's episode 6 where I actually play some clips of me talking to him directly in a class that he gave on the book about a month and a half after it came out in 2021. So that's kind of interesting. I got to ask him some of the questions that we'll probably talk about today.
And that book is this right here, In Quest
Yeah.
of the Historical Adam
In my
by William Lane Craig.
bookshelf somewhere.
Yeah. So that'd be interesting. I was the one who actually looked up that passage when you were on Standing for Truth. And
Oh,
Yeah, I was the one who looked it up. Donnie was and this theistic evolutionist who goes by Cool Jesus uh, on the his YouTube channel, and he was on there. He's like, well, Craig defines it in 104 because we were saying he doesn't really define it exactly. It's an argument from incredulity pretty much. But he was saying that he does define it on 104, and then Donnie was like, who I know by the way, he's like, well, what does he say about it exactly? And I tagged both of them, and I said, I got his book. You want me to look it up? And Donnie's like, yeah, I do. So I looked it up and got the exact reference. on pages 104, 105. We'll probably talk about that a little bit later too, as well.
Yep.
Um, but anyway, so as just kind of a quick introduction, you have a podcast named you'll have to keep pronouncing it for me.
Yeah, I ignored probably good advice and choosing a name that was easier to say. So a phage is Phage, and that's a term for virus in biology. And a macrophage is a kind of cell. It's basically like a white blood cell in your immune system. So
So
macrophage,
your podcast is called Microphage,
macro.
Macrophage.
Yeah, but it's actually easier to find my stuff. I realized just looking up my name, like if you search YouTube or Spotify and just type in my name, Ben Kissling, with two S's, that's actually easier to find my stuff. I found out because if you type in macrophage on YouTube, you get a bunch of science videos about macrophages, and mine doesn't come up. But if you type my name, you'll find it.
When I first started my Christian apologetic ministry, and I started it with my YouTube channel. So I had a YouTube channel called Apologetics 101. I started it because I was doing a debate response to the debate I had with a guy online and from India, and that we were going back and forth. But when I first started my apologetic, I put this Apologetics 101. I was trying to help find it for this atheist friend of mine, and when I looked at Apologetics 101 YouTube, bunch of videos came. I was like, oh no, maybe this was not a good name. But after my channel became popular, it actually moved up to the list all the way to the top of YouTube. So I was like, okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably not any names you can pick nowadays that someone doesn't already have. So,
Yeah. Well, Apologetics 101 wasn't someone's channel. It's just the fact that a lot of people probably title a video Apologetics 101 or where they do a lecture on apologetics or some of that nature. So, but I don't have not found a specific channel other than mine. There's named specifically Apologetics 101. So that's good at least. But anyway, okay, let's move forward. Then I will be linking his podcast below. Relevant to this discussion, however, is that Ben, you have studied the subject matter of William Lane Craig's book, his thesis, his arguments for the past 5 years. In fact, the way you talk on Standing for Truth, it sounds like that you've thought of nothing else for the past 5 years.
yeah, I mean, I what happened was I was doing a Sunday school class at my church in late 2019, and so I just started looking stuff up on Origins, and I found Craig's Sunday school series that he was doing at that time on this topic, and a lot of that stuff ended up in the book. So this was actually before the book was published and even before it was written. Um, but if you go there are a few places in the transcript of the Sunday school class that are just his notes that he puts up publicly with the videos, and you can see some of it is almost word for word certain passages in the book. So um, he did the Sunday school class as a part of his study and research for the book, I think. So that's called the Defenders 3 Excursus on Creation of Life and Biological Diversity. And that's the one that I did like a 20-hour YouTube series like critiquing. So there's actually a lot of stuff in there that didn't make it into the book. So it's kind of interesting.
Right. Talking about Craig's
Like
book.
he had,
I was saying you didn't. You were
what's
saying
that?
you saying it didn't make it in Craig's book, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah,
Am I?
like he had some critiques of other views in the Sunday school class that he didn't end up putting in the book. So
Okay. Okay. Good. Thank you. But in my take in all of this, the what got me interested in this was that I knew about William Lane Craig's I never heard him talk about Genesis. I didn't even know he was a theistic evolutionist until this situation happened. I was just aware that yeah, I
Well,
was aware
like
that
I always thought he was an old Earth creationist, and
exactly.
I think he would still call himself that, but he definitely has moved really close to theistic evolution, if not all the way. My suspicion is he's still kind of evolving his views on that, but I don't know for sure.
Right. But It, but anyway, I didn't know what his views were on Genesis because he's never really talked about Genesis up until recently in recent times. And he usually talks about the resurrection or the existence of God or something like that. And when I found out he was going to do a book on the historical Adam, people doing things on historical Jesus all the time, I was like, oh, well, that's good. It sounded like, he believes Adam existed and that sort of thing. But then I come to find out because even before his book was even published, he was already talking about his arguments and thesis and in videos and in lectures. And you talked about the Finish 3 series he had. I think I might have seen some of that. And he also has a First Things article. I don't know if you read that. It basically summarizes his book. Um, I actually got that pulled up on my browser. But it's the First Things article that he wrote. And I got the book and I started going through it. And immediately I was like, this needs to be responded to. Um, and one of my fears was that eventually that because of his influence and his popularity and the fact that lots and lots of people respect him as a scholar, I was afraid it would, influence people, in that direction. But an exact opposite actually happened. Lots and lots of people from all spectrums, whether you're dealing with young Earth creationists, whether you're dealing with old Earth creationists, whether you're dealing with theistic evolutionists, have issues with Craig's book, which it turns out at the very beginning of Craig's book, he actually anticipated, he predicted that this would happen, that that because he's dealing with a highly controversial subject matter, that there's no way to satisfy everybody, and I think that that's true. But it's interesting the fact that it wasn't quite the blowout that I thought it was going to be, but I actually reached out to the publisher of Craig's book and I asked them for permission to do a response book. Um, Normally you can do a response book, without permission as long as you don't like overstep your bounds. But I was afraid that if I quote Craig too much or reference too much of his source, because I'm doing a response book to a specific book. And so I went and reached out to I think his name was Tom Avery or something like that. He's the publisher over WMB Earnmans, or the subsidiary rights manager over there, and he's the one who actually answers the email. And after me and him corresponded a little bit about it, and he gave me permission. So I actually been sitting on legal permission to write a response book for the past 3 years, and I just now started again. And you wrote an article. That's another thing that we forgot to mention. You wrote an article, a really good article, critiquing Craig's book on creation.com too. Isn't that right?
Yeah, on creation.com, it's called a review of the historical inquest of the historical Adam, which is the full title. I think sometimes I've seen it called different things, but yeah, it went through a review process there that was really good, so they helped me write that.
Right. Was it just on their website or was it like on their peer review publication?
It's just on the website.
Okay. Okay. I was just wondering because sometimes they put some things on there from their peer review publication.
Yeah.
Does Craig, I don't know if First Things is peer reviewed or not. Um, does Craig have anything peer reviewed on this?
On this, um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what process he went through for the book. Um, I don't know. No.
Doesn't seem like it because I think Erdman's is not a peer review publication, and First Things I wasn't sure about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he had official peer review on it, but he was certainly talking to lots of people, especially Joshua Swamidass, for a lot of the science stuff. So, in fact, at one point, Swamidass was telling anyone who would listen that he was going to be the co-author of the book, but that didn't happen. So, but I don't know if anything officially peer reviewed.
No, Swami does also have some issues with Craig's thesis because I think that there's some friction there with the who they think Adam was, people outside the guard, and things like that in there.
Yeah, I mean, they have different models, but personally, they are friends.
Yeah.
And they talked a lot behind the scenes about all this stuff. So,
All right.
uh,
I figured we could just kind of start with some positives. That's where most people start. Is where you start in your article as well on things that we agree that we agree with Craig on. We don't disagree like 100% on everything he says. There are some things that he acknowledges in the book. In fact, despite our strong disagreements with Craig, interesting enough, I do find him to be a very honest apologist. So I don't think he's being dishonest. I think he really believes what he's saying. So and but this is kind of a surprising admission that knowing that especially given Craig's recent because Craig's been the most I don't know if this is the right way of saying it, contemporary, you know, contempted for our position, be and on verbally online. He says things like it would be a nightmare. That's a famous quote. You know, it would be a nightmare if our position was true, and or you know if YC position was true. And he's also said that on a podcast with Frank Turek one time I heard him say he thinks the young Earth Christians should go away. So he's not been very friendly toward our position at all. So some of the things in there, I imagine you're going to talk about here in a second, was very surprising that he admitted to and even taken seriously our position on things that he would normally laugh off and not deal with.
yeah, I think the as far back as about 2012 or 2013, he said he said something about on one of his podcasts that like 50% of evangelical pastors are young earthers, and he said this is an embarrassment. And I always wanted to ask him who is it an embarrassment to? Like you or God? I mean, I don't what is embarrassing about it and who is embarrassed by this? If it turns out if it's just him who's embarrassed by it, well, who cares?
But anyway, would you like to talk about stuff that he's put in the book that you would say, yeah, we would agree with that. We can go with that. Obviously, we might
Yeah,
get
sure.
stuff later, but just kind of get the finer points.
So I put a list of 7 things that young Earth creationists agree with Craig on that he has in the book. The first one is that in the preface of the book, he appears to admit that our view is the traditional view and other views are revisionist. Uh, Second thing is he admits that the Genesis author understood the days of creation as 24 hours, which is a big admission. Many old earthers do not admit that, like Hugh Ross and others. They think that the 24-hour days of creation are actually much longer periods. But because he thinks that the story is largely fictional or did not historically happen, he can say, yeah, the days are 24 hours in the story, but just they didn't happen in real history, right? Another thing is he disagrees again with Hugh Ross on Noah's flood being local, and he thinks in the story it is a global flood, even though he does not believe that the global flood actually happened historically. So it's a similar kind of thing there. Because he's taking a sort of fictional view of the text, he can interpret it pretty straightforwardly. as we would. It's just he's going to say that it didn't actually happen, right? So another one is there's a popular claim that the ancient Hebrews were some kind of flat earther type, had some kind of flat earth cosmology where they thought that there's a flat earth and there's a solid dome above it that's the sky. Um, so like they'll argue, for example, that I think it says in Genesis actually the windows of heavens were opened or something like that. I know it's somewhere else in the Bible, if not there. So some people have argued they thought there was actually a solid dome above the earth that had to like open for water to come down, you know. And so he just debunks this claim quite well, actually. That Hebrew word there is rakia. Um, so we would agree with him on that. The second half of the book is the part about science. So he kind of divides the book into two different halves. The first half is kind of the one that I usually focus on. That's his biblical interpretation. And the second half of the book, his entire point is just that um, all these fossils that we found of humanoid or hominin-like creatures like Neanderthals and Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo naledi, lots of different groups like that are actually really human, which is another difference from someone like Hugh Ross, who would say those are not actually humans, because Ross and other old earthers want to put the origin of modern humans, that is, image bearers of God, right, and Adam and Eve, much sooner in time than things like Neanderthals and Denisovans. So they want to not really human. And Craig is comfortable pushing the origin of humanity way, way back until about 700,000 years ago or more, um, which puts Adam and Eve in a group called Homo heidelbergensis.
In my understanding,
Under
your
the umbrella of humanity as descendants of Adam and Eve, which is something that young Earth creationists have been saying for a very long time. I heard Marcus Ross say that it's at least been a century since young Earth creationists have claimed that groups like Neanderthals are just humans. So that's something we can agree on. I already mentioned that Craig does accept a real historical Adam and Eve, so we agree on that. And the number six that I have in the article is that Craig has admitted that his denial of the historicity of Genesis is based largely on subjective criteria. That may not be so much of an agreement as kind of he's admitting the weakness of his interpretation, not openly, but sort of in a roundabout way, because as you said, he's an intellectually honest person, right? And so he doesn't try to give this whole fantastic interpretation of Genesis like Hugh Ross or somebody else. He basically just says, look, my thesis is very modest, and it is just that the genre of Genesis 1 through 11 is myth, right? And he doesn't go any farther than that. And he kind of uses this group of family resemblances that we'll talk about, which is not it's not a slam dunk type of case. So
right, and we're going to
that's
talk
very
a lot more about his subjectiveness later on as well. All right.
yeah.
I have a quote here on in terms of the strength of the hermeneutics from Craig. It says, thus, Bible believing Christians have better hope that the young earth creationist hermeneutic claim is also false, lest we be thrown back into the worst case scenarios. We therefore need to consider the option that Genesis 1 to 11 need not to be taken literally. Craig, in Quest of the Historical Adam, page 14. Um, exactly uh, what do you think about this? Do you see that that there's a part of him that is saying, okay, the straightforward rendering of the text does support this claim. Oh no, we can't let that happen, kind of thing, reaction.
Yeah, this was actually what got me interested in Craig to begin with, because this sentiment appears in a question of the week that he did some years before. And I sent in so he does this question of the week thing where people can send in questions and he answers it in written form every week. And so I sent in a question of the week asking him directly, like, why can't you have another possible solution? And that's just that some scientific claims might be wrong. He doesn't want to consider that, right? And in that quote you read, he never considers that. He never considers that the scientific claims might be wrong, which to me reveals that he is thinking of science as his source of ultimate truth, meaning that whatever science says must be correct. And we can't argue it. It has to be the truth. And therefore, if the young earth creationists are right about the reading of Genesis, then the Bible teaches error and must be false. Well, why? That's the part that he actually does say. Why does he assume that the Bible must be false unless he assumes that scientific claims about the age of the earth must be true? And that's kind of the unstated premise of his argument, right? Is that he is saying that these scientific claims must be true. Otherwise, you could just say, well, another possible solution here is these claims are just wrong. But he refuses to consider that. And so I think this is evidence that he is taking scientific claims to be absolutely true, which
Right.
is weird because there's a number of reasons why this is weird. Um,
The
one of the
funny
reasons,
I was going to say
go
the funny
ahead.
thing is, every scientific discovery ever made went against what people believed at the time. In fact, if that wasn't the case, it wouldn't be discovery. So the fact that it's like, okay, just because the most scientists accept something as true doesn't is not true. To me, that doesn't even strike me as very scientific. But scientists consider science to be provisional, like it's something that can change depending on discoveries and new information and things like that. And so when you get to things like deep time, Big Bang, evolution, it's almost like they are even more dogmatic than Christians are about the Bible. It's like it's no longer a ever changing area. It's like that this has got to be it no matter what. And Craig seems to be under the impression that it has to be, or all science would fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, this is rhetoric that's often used against young Earth creationists. This is another thing I've noticed with him and with others like him is they tend to use arguments against young Earth creationists that they wouldn't use in any other circumstance. So Craig knows full well everything you just said. He knows that about science. He knows that it's provisional. And he even denies current scientific consensus on at least two areas that I know of, um, having to do with general relativity and quantum mechanics. And he says, no, they're wrong. In fact, I hit him with this quote of his from one of his own speeches. In the first question that I asked him in that class that you can hear on the podcast episode, I asked him, he says basically that the entirety of the 20th century physics is based on the twin pillars of quantum mechanics and relativity, which he says are themselves based on this philosophical claim called verificationism, which he denies, right? So, why, and he has philosophical reasons for this, right? Which we don't need to get into, but, he is well aware that science rests on philosophical assumptions that can be wrong. Um, and in his answer to me, he basically said, this is how I would decide whether or not to accept a scientific claim, is whether there's some philosophical reason to reject it.
I wonder
Um,
if his reasons for rejecting general, or at least underlying reasons for rejecting general relativity. General relativity and special relativity, the big difference is that general relativity deals with gravity, and special relativity basically ignores it. And that's dealing with like the singularity and the alleged Big Bang, because I know this is not your field, but it's something interesting. The quantum mechanics and relativity don't work good together
right.
at that small level because quantum mechanics essentially, like special relativity, ignores gravity. And so what happens in terms of the physics of the universe to squish everything down to that size? And so scientists say that they don't know um, what happens inside of a singularity because no known physics that we have can work inside of a singularity. And so I wonder if it makes it easier to
Yeah.
believe in that if you deny general relativity. You know what I'm saying?
So he wouldn't say that he rejects general relativity. He takes a different interpretation of it called the Lorentzian interpretation, which actually predates Einstein. But yeah, he knows everything that you just said. He knows that general relativity and quantum mechanics are incompatible. So, but it doesn't change the fact that they're both the current consensus and they're both the best two theories that science has ever discovered if you measure it in terms of accuracy of predictions. So, um, you know,
Um, all right. How does William Lane Craig define myth exactly? What does he think myth is? Um, this might end up getting us into the family resemblance argument, but essentially, give a kind of basic definition. How does he define myth exactly? What does he think it is?
well, I think it would get into the family resemblances thing because he says that um, a myth, there is no necessary and sufficient condition for a text to be a myth, right? Because you know all of them, whatever condition you suggest, there'll be an exception to the rule, right? So he suggests these 10 family resemblances going off of uh, Wittgenstein, I think. His German is better than mine, but it's a way of comparing things, that are difficult to compare. So. Um, I think he says that this is the method that was used to put the Gospels in the genre of ancient biography. And so he says, "Well, let's do the same thing with Genesis 1 through 11." And he finds that, yes, it does fit the category of myth or the genre of myth.
Yeah, but I think that they were looking at the actual style of the literature, the way it's woven. We're going to get into that as well because you kind of alluded to this. I know Dr. Jason Lyles talked about it. I don't know if you read his articles in response to the Craig's First Things article on Biblical Science Institute,
I read them a while ago.
but you have read them before then.
Yeah.
Dr. Jason Lau has a response where he sees uh, Craig equivocating on the word myth. And I think you also referenced it in your interview with Donnie on Standing for Truth as well. Is that what you see that like he's equivocating on the word myth because there's different definitions of the word myth, and so the way the word myth can be understood, there's one way it could be understood, which could be understood truthfully or historically even, like the man, myth, the legend. I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about someone that doesn't exist. There is a definition of myth that can mean something historical, but there's also a definition of myth pertaining to the literary style of myth, in which case does not mean something historical. It actually means the opposite of something historical. So do you see him kind of going from the myth that can mean something historical to equivocating to the kind that means something that's non-historical?
Um, Yeah, it's hard to tell what he was actually saying sometimes about myth because he wants to put Genesis in a category, a genre called mytho-history. So his view would be that there is some kind of what he calls historical interest in Genesis 1 through 11, and at least the author had some historical interest. Now, what that means, he didn't really explain. Um,
On historical interest, that's interesting. How what does he mean by historical interest? And uh, well, I'll ask the next question after you. He prefers the historical interest with the genealogies, correct?
yeah, so he says that the genealogies are evidence that the author of Genesis had historical interest. And that's, as far as I can tell, pretty much the only thing that he's willing to commit to as being actually historical, which I suspect is because the gospel authors also use these genealogies. Luke and Matthew have genealogies that reflect the genealogies in Genesis. But since the amount of time that passes are not in the genealogies in the Gospels, he's comfortable denying that that's historical. Even though if you're just looking at Genesis itself, the years that pass before they have sons and the number of years before they die, that seems to be the most historical thing about the entire Genesis 1 through 11 is the time that passes, right? That's literally what history is. So uh, he is somehow comfortable denying the years are real, but the people in the genealogies are real. And that's his evidence that there's something historical about the story. But everything else he either denies is historical or says we can't tell for sure what
Do,
is or is not historical.
do you see the term? This is something me and Dr. Lau both. I did it originally before even before Dr. Lau published on this, because I actually was in a debate with a theistic evolutionist who was supporting Craig's book, and I actually mentioned this because I noticed this as well, and then Dr. Lau, a couple months later did the article that they actually put this in there as well. But do you see mytho-history as being an oxymoron? Obviously, the mytho part of mytho-history is intended to be in contrast to history, so it's something non-historical, but yet history obviously exact opposite, and these two are exact opposites from each other. So, do you see them as kind of being a an oxymoron type term?
Well, I don't think I do see that. So he he gives the examples of the Greek myths, right? Where you have like Achilles going and fighting at the Battle of Troy, right? The Greeks fight at Troy. Like, I think his idea is that there may have been a real Battle of Troy or something like that, but much of the account of the battle is mythical, in the sense that it's not historically accurate. And I think that's what he thinks mytho-history is. Um, but he does a lot of he references a lot of scholars in this area that he calls folklorists, that make a distinction between myth and legend. So a legend is supposed to be something that does have a clear historical basis. So an example would be like George Washington and the story of the cherry tree. Like we don't actually believe that really happened, right? But what it is George Washington was a real person and the story was made up to tell the truth about George Washington, that he's an honest person, right? That's an example of a legend. It's something that's based on a real person. Um, so in his when he uses the term myth, it's almost like he's denying that it is a legend, meaning that Genesis 1 through 11 is a legend in the sense that it's based on real people, but it just became the actual history got sort of changed and altered over time. right? He seems to deny that, and yet the only things that he really believes are true about the story are the existence of these people. So a myth tends to be a more of a story that forms or grounds our understanding of reality in something. And he specifically calls it an etiological myth, that it grounds present realities in the distant past, right? Which leaves open the question of whether that distant past actually happened or not. And so it's clear that Craig is trying to argue that that distant past did not actually happen. And the reason that the ancient Hebrews told this myth or this story is to try and make sense of the world that they lived in a way that could make sense to them. But it didn't actually happen, right? And I think that causes problems with viewing the text as inspired. Um, because if that's what they actually meant, if that's what the text actually means to teach, and that's what the author affirmed and said, this is the explanation for how things are the way they are now, but that didn't actually happen. This is the view that would entail that the Bible is false. Um, Ironically, not young Earth creationism. Um, so I think he has a problem there in his thesis for sure. But there are such things as myths that have some kind of historical basis. Um, so I wouldn't say
Yeah,
it's an oxymoron. I would say what?
I was gonna say you can say
I,
that
I would
it's. Oh, sorry.
I would just say that the genre of mytho-history is not, in my view, distinct from the genre of myth. So I don't know why he decided to use the term mytho-history. Um, I think he should have just called it a myth and then
That's what John
made
Walker.
it more clear about, yeah, so and made it more clear about which, like, what kind of truth that he thinks is in the story. Um, so
Of course, with myths, you can
it,
actually.
it is a little muddled.
I was gonna say in myths, you can actually have kernels of historical truths, but the literary style would still be myth. Like in the case of the Trojan War, for example,
Yeah.
there's
And
some.
and so that's why I say yeah, like I'm actually comfortable calling Genesis 1 through 11 a myth. Because that doesn't necessarily exclude it from being historical. So the arguments that you have to look for in Craig's book are specifically arguments that deny the historicity of the story. And there are some that he brings up that don't seem to work very well. um, in connection with Genesis. And he kind of ignores that. It's very strange. This is why I feel like I got a little bit more out of this because I watched what he said in the class before the book. In the class before the book, he was literally arguing that um, according to the folklorists, right, there's this quality of myths that seem to show that they're not historical, and that is there are two of them. They're called plasticity or flexibility. Plasticity is just the idea that the myth can have different versions at the same time. And this shows that the people who told this story don't really believe it's true, right? That because they're playing fast and loose and telling different versions of the same story, um, it's more like what I would call a scientific theory, right? Is like this is a theory about how things are the way they are, and we're not necessarily saying it's true, right? Flexibility is the same sort of quality, except it's over time. So different versions of the myth appear over time. And that he says is also indication that it's that even the original people who told this story didn't believe it was true. The problem is you can't apply that to Genesis because there are no alternate versions of the story. Um, and so he basically admits this in the book. Um, so he talks about these two criteria, and they end up not applying to Genesis. So it's not an argument against Genesis as historicity. The only other real arguments he has against its historicity are what we talked about at the beginning, like the palpably false thing, that there are fantastic elements in the story that are, quote, palpably false, that entail some kind of internal incoherence or contradictions in the story. And his claim is that, first of all, that the ancient people would have recognized this contradiction internal to the one version of the story that we have. And that indicates that they weren't concerned about it being true in a historical sense. And then so he uses a bunch of fairly familiar arguments to claim that there are contradictions in the Genesis story, um, which, I would argue are not really contradictions, but I also would argue that just because there are contradictions in it doesn't mean the people didn't believe it was true.
That's a different.
Because we can give examples even today of people who,
Oh, go
well,
ahead.
I didn't hear that.
Oh, I was saying that that would be a different issue, whether it is, because even if there were contradictions, that wouldn't necessarily mean it's true. And I kind of wonder, I actually put this I was working on this when I was doing my writing my book, but I wonder if Craig, I mean, how does Craig deal with all cultural situations where you get different versions of the story, or that the story has some degree of flexibility to it, and even with a control oral culture, there's some degree of flexibility. Would he consider that myth if you have different uh like different tellings of the story? I mean, does he just I mean how does he deal with the oral culture aspect of verbally telling a story and then having some degree of flexibility in the way they tell it, you think?
Well, he would say that that's evidence that they didn't accept this as real history
Yeah, but he would never
if they
apply
had
that
a
to the
different
gospel.
version of it.
He wouldn't apply that to the gospels, would he?
I didn't hear that last part.
I said he wouldn't apply that to the gospels though, would he?
I don't think so, no.
So would you think this would be inconsistent that he would not consistently apply the same criteria across the Bible?
I would think it is inconsistent, yes. His reply would be that the Gospels are a different genre of literature than Genesis. But of course, that's kind of begging the question a little bit. That's the very thing that's under discussion is what genre it's in.
Right. Uh, all right.
So
Would
yeah.
would you consider? Well, before I get to this, because I was going to talk about the subjectiveness of his arguments there. But before we get into that, we kind of moved too far away from it when you referenced etiology, and I think that's an important thing because define etiology and tell us what does Craig say about that, and why does he think this is equivalent to myth, and so forth.
Etiology just means grounding present realities in the distant past. And so that's what he thinks Genesis is an etiological myth. So, for example, the origin of snakes, the origin of human government in Genesis 9 with the Noahic covenant, the origin of, all things, right? The creation of the universe, the origin of male and female, the origin of marriage, the origin of all that stuff in chapter 4, where it says, like, Tubal-Cain was the father of all those who, I can't remember all the details, but played the harp and lyre, and then there was the father of all those who worked metal, and Nimrod, the hunter, and all this stuff. So I think it's clear that Genesis is some kind of etiology, right? It is telling us here is the historical origin or basis for things that exist today. Um, So in that sense, I'd agree that it is an etiology. The question is whether it's true or not. Right? And the problem that I think Craig has is if he's going to say that it's not historical in the sense that it's didn't actually happen, then how could it be a true etiology? If it's not the actual way that those things began, like the origin of the universe, then it's a false etiology. So how do you reconcile that with the divine inspiration of Scripture? That to me is kind of this trilemma that he has, right? There's three things here, and I don't think he can hold all three. One is the doctrine of inerrancy, or even just divine inspiration, that the text is true. The second is that it's an etiology, meaning it's grounding present realities in the distant past. And the third is that it's not historical.
Right. And there, and
So,
we say the same
or at
thing
least the
about.
parts.
Well, I was going to say we say the same thing about marriage. Like the whole point of Jesus' sermon is to ground the way marriage originally was established by God. And but if this never actually happened, then it'd be pointless to sit there and point out it like, hey, look, don't you know that marriage was established this way, but it didn't really happen that way? It wouldn't make much sense.
Yeah, it would, on Craig's view, it would have to happen the way that he thinks it happened, which is that God took a male and a female of this Homo heidelbergensis species and then caused a mutation in each of them, and they became Adam and Eve, right? But that's not what Genesis says. And yes, Jesus is referring to that. So
Not what
it
Jesus
is
said
kind of
either,
odd.
right?
Yeah. It's like he wants to replace what Genesis says with his own account of it.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's the feeling I got as well. Like he was trying to say, "Hey, look, we can't really take the text as is, so let's focus on what I think actually happened and let's replace it with that." Um, and another thing is I was going to ask about etiology is what's he do about etiologies in other places in the Old Testament, like in the case of Esther, where it shows the origin of a particular feast, and so we have we have Esther that shows that okay, this is where that feast comes from that was practiced in in New Testament times, and so that shows like an etiology that grounds that particular feast. And same thing also is true for Passover in Exodus. The Passover feast that was practiced by the Jews and was done in the Gospels and so forth. And we know where that originated from. So does Craig even try to deal with this question of etiologies in other places in Scripture?
he pretty much ignores that, and even more so when people bring up arguments like what you just mentioned. When and I've done this personally, I brought up, okay, if you're going to say this about Genesis, like for example, he denies the talking snake. He says that's a fantastic element of the text. So I say, okay, what about the talking donkey in the story of Balaam in the book of Numbers, I believe it is? And his response to all arguments like that are basically, my focus is Genesis 1 through 11. And so this is only Genesis 1 through 11. And if you're trying to use my standards of textual interpretation anywhere else, that doesn't work. Or like I'm not doing that. He just wants to avoid that completely. It's like he's trying to invent standards of interpretation that only apply to these 11 chapters of this book. Um, and I think we can have legitimate questions about why he wants to section it off like that. Um, you know, he's gonna come at you if you say, well, you're only doing this because you're trying to reinterpret it because of science.
Right.
That's what I think he is doing. But he's gonna say, well, that's questioning my motives, right? Well, then why aren't you using, the same standard of interpretation everywhere in the Bible? Like you said, all these other places count as etiologies, like the feast you mentioned. Um, this criteria of being palpably false or fantastic uh, is all over the Bible. Balaam's talking donkey is fantastic. The resurrection is fantastic. Um,
This is an
People
argument.
have used the argument.
It's an argument from incredulity, basically, that he's arguing that it's so incredible that you just can't believe that it's true. And that brings me up to another issue, the subjectiveness of some of this criteria, including that one. That one's a big one because essentially it is based on Craig's sensitivity of what he thinks is true or not true in the text. Is that correct?
Well, I would say so, yeah.
All right.
Um, and what's that?
Well, I was gonna say, I was saying all right, but I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I want to show you something real quick. I think that this is it's interesting because the way he responds to this. Right, let me go share my screen.
Peter Lightheart.
Yep, Lightheart. All right. Hey, he says, in a response to Craig in First Things, he says, how does Craig know all this? Why preserve the historical reality of Methuselah and Noah while dispensing with their ages, real persons and events, he says, clothed in metaphorical and figurative language of myth, but clothes make the man. But what criterion does Craig distinguish one from another? He offers no argument relying on readers to share his prejudices concerning plausibility. To which we may ask, whose plausibility? Craig thinks the ages of early men are too long to be literal, but Augustine might disagree, as might Usher or millions of Christians between the two, and since who have constructed chronologies from the numbers of Genesis. The account of Eden and the fall is clearly metaphorical or figurative, but clear to whom? Not to Irenaeus or Ephraim the Syrian, John of Damascus, or Thomas Aquinas, Luther or Calvin, or millions of Jews and Christians who have believed Eden was a real place and that Satan tempted through an actual reptile. What makes talking snake stranger than a talking monkey? Cherubim are creatures of fantasy, Craig says. I wager the prophet Ezekiel would beg to differ. Craig dismisses the idea that God walked in the garden, but if the Creator can walk by the Sea of Galilee, why not Eden? Craig asserts, but assertion isn't argument, much less proof. Now let me go over to Craig's response to this. The plausibility of this genre classification for Genesis 1 to 11 in no way depends upon our ability to tease apart which aspects of the story are mythical and which are historical. I suspect that the blend is more like coffee and cream than like colored marbles in a bag. We most emphatically do not determine what Genesis teaches about Adam by mining the nuggets of history hidden under layers of metaphor. That is not how literary criticism works. All right, if I'm understanding that correctly, he's essentially saying once you say it's myth, then you could pretty much say, well, he's also saying it's impossible to tell what's history and what's myth, but he thinks that the genealogies would be a good example of areas where he thinks it is myth. But it was kind of funny to me because it come across that like he was saying that once you establish its myth, it doesn't, you can pretty much be subjective as you want to be in terms of your sensibilities of what's true and what's not, and what's myth and what's not. And because it's all blended together in some sort of collage of myth and history. And so uh, what would you think about this idea of do you see this criteria as being subjective, like it's based on Craig's personal sensitivity of what's true, what's false, what he's willing to believe versus what he's not willing to believe.
Yeah, I mean, it would be easier to tell what he's actually thinking if he told us. But for the most part, he refuses to give us an actual interpretation of the text. And you can see this when he promotes the book, when he talks about the book, when he talks about his idea. All he says is, I am giving a genre analysis. He doesn't claim to be giving us an interpretation of the text. He doesn't claim to be giving us a hermeneutic of the text. All he is saying is this is a genre, and I am ending my discussion at that point. Um, Now, in the book, he does give these theological interpretations, which is strange because that's not the argument that he was making for the entire first half of the book, that this is a theological text that has theological meaning. Like, he doesn't really make that claim. And then suddenly at the end, he's like, well, okay, here's what it kind of means. And he has these very broad, like, things like God created the universe. Um, that God shows his justice and mercy in the story of the flood, which didn't actually happen, and things like that. So I think what he is trying to say in that passage that you read is that we should interpret this um, as having some kind of moral, like the moral of the story is, and take the moral of the story as true, but not the actual details of the story as true. I think that's what he's trying to say.
I don't know what like you
Um,
allegory, like a ace
yeah,
fables and stuff. Um, but then
yeah.
you have to demonstrate that it is a myth to begin with. Which, by the way, that reminds me, that's one of the biggest things that he issues is that myths do not take the claims in the myth to be literal. In some sense, that they're always allegorical. Do you agree with that? I'm not really sure what I don't have any kind of strong opinion of that yet. So I was curious what your take is of that.
I mean, I'm of the opinion that a myth can include historical facts that are true, in exactly the same way that C.S. Lewis called the gospel story a true myth. Um, so he says this is a myth because it's a world-forming story, right? It forms our understanding of the world, and that's true of the gospel, right? But Lewis says it's also true, and he meant historically true. So he called it a true myth. Craig has at times said that he's not using Lewis's definition, um, but I'm a little unclear as to the definition he actually is using. I mean, it seems to be the same thing to me, but
Right.
but he want except for the fact that he wants to say the truth is in the moral of the story and not the facts of the case or something like that. I don't know, but I don't really see a distinction there.
Next, I want to talk about the family resemblances. He gives like eight in his First Things article and in his book, I believe. Um, He says myths are narratives, whether oral or literary. Myths are traditional stories handed down from generation to generation. Myths are sacred for the society that embraces them. Myths are objects of beliefs for members of the society that embraces them. Myths are set in primeval age or another realm. Myths are stories in which deities are important characters. Myths seek to anchor present realities, such as the world, mankind, natural phenomenon, a cultural practice, and prevailing cult in a pre-mortal time. We already talked about that one. And myths exhibit fantastic elements and are not troubled by logical contradictions or incoherence. We also talked about that as well. So, how would do you see these as being like really broad, like that they can include a lot of things, and it's almost like, okay, when you define something, you really need to, as Oswald put it, I got his book somewhere right here, The Bible Among the Myths, right here. He says that it should be you should narrow your definition, but you don't want it too narrow. You know, you don't want to define a car as a vehicle with four wheels, because then you might exclude cars with three wheels or something of that nature. So you don't want to get too narrow, but you don't want to get too broad either. So do you see these criteria like drawing the circle way too broad that it would obviously exclude a lot different the Bible and and other historical works that we know of that are history, and it would exclude those things because he's drawing the circle so broad that they can include things that we know is of the literary style of history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these family resemblances are largely, many of them do not exclude history from them. Um, and so the kind of central question is Craig, by including these among his criteria for myth, I called it padding the stats. So he wants to strengthen the case that it belongs in this genre that he claims, and so he has all these criteria that fit a myth, but they also fit many other things. And so, but he says, well, because Genesis fits this, 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 and this, and this, that's overall pretty good evidence that it's a myth. Um, okay, but it doesn't tell you whether it's historical or not, because many of these things, these criteria that he uses can also be historical. Um, so in that sense, I tended to focus on the criteria that seem to differentiate between something that's not historical versus something that is historical. And there's not even close to 10 or 8 criteria in that category. Um, some of
Uh,
it we already talked about, but the others are the etiology thing and the fantastic elements thing. Those are the ones that I think that he uses the most to try and claim that it's not historical.
right. Also, with trying to look at with how does he deal with that with miracles? I mean, he just yeah, it does seem like he kind of ignores that because I mean, he defends miracles. He defends the resurrection, which is a miracle. And so, wouldn't that exclude fantastic elements? Wouldn't that exclude miracles?
Yep.
Yep, definitely.
But
So, that becomes a
it again, because it's a subjective. What's that?
I'll say it becomes a worldview issue then. Which the funny thing is, it's being consistent to his own worldview because his worldview would allow miracles.
Right, but these miracles in particular are fantastic, but other ones are not.
The resurrection ain't
Which again, it comes back to a point we already talked about, right? Is I
right,
think part of his worldview, part of his background information that he's using to evaluate the Genesis story is the scientific claims about the history of the universe and the history of life on Earth and everything else. He regards these stories as having fantastic elements because he has already decided what the truth is.
right.
And anything opposed to that is going to seem fantastic to him, right? So he's including the background knowledge that he gleans from science in this determination. Whereas having been a Christian since high school and believing in the story of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus and all this stuff, he doesn't consider that to be fantastic because it's what he already believes, right? So this is the subjectivity of it, right? It's just uh everything, whatever he can agree with actually happened, must have, because it's not fantastic according to my background information, but everything that is fantastic according to me, right,
Seems
could not
arbitrary,
have been the truth because,
kind of arbitrary. Just the
well,
way
yeah, I think so.
is that you say that that's the case that it's arbitrary.
I think so, yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest things that people have actually started to notice or have been noticing about Craig's position is that it's so arbitrary. It's based on his personal sensitivities of what he thinks is myth, history, true, false, etc. And that's not exactly a good criteria to use because what happens when it comes to the sensitivities of other people? that might be different. And so it becomes really subjective in the way in which he's approaching this. Um, all right. What about the literary styles of the myths? I've heard that, or actually, I know I know this because I've actually read some of these, like Enuma Elish. I got the Babylonian account on my computer, but they're very poetic in the way it flows. It's almost like it's disjoined, like it's like there's events in it, but the events don't seem very well connected to each other, like it's flowing like poetry. Is that your feel from it when you read like Enuma Elish and other types of um, accounts like that from ancient Near Eastern accounts, and it differs quite extensively in terms of the way in which it's written, because you could tell Genesis is written like history, like this has happened. The events, in fact, even in Hebrew, they have, I don't know if you're familiar with Hebrew. I know that Dr. Stephen Boyd, who's a Hebrew scholar, has done a lot of work on this, and in Hebrew, there's certain verbs that are used a lot in historical narrative, in Hebrew historical narrative, like finite verbs and some things like that. And also another thing is what's called the Bob consecutive, that kind of links these events to each other in a kind of consecutive form. Now, Craig says something in his book where he says mere chronology does not mean history. Exactly what does he mean by that?
I mean, probably what he means is, let's see, mere chronology, however, is not sufficient to indicate a historical interest.
Yeah.
The Enuma Elish contains chronologically arranged stories, but hardly has a historical interest.
Yeah, that's the quote.
What makes Genesis 1 through 11 different is that I'm quoting from the book, yeah. What makes Genesis 1 through 11 different is that the genealogies move seamlessly into the historical period of the patriarchs, where the historical interest is obvious and not in dispute. Okay, so what he appears to be saying here is that um, the people in the genealogies lead seamlessly right into Abraham, right? Because you've got his great all his unbroken line all the way back to Adam, Terah, Nahor, and then Abraham, and it goes seamlessly into Genesis 12 through 50, which he says is not in dispute that it's historical, right? So he wants to say that Genesis 1 through 11 has this historical character, but Genesis 12 through 50 really doesn't. So that's what I read him to be saying. But he has a problem because the genealogies lead seamlessly into Genesis 12 through 50. In fact, you can continue the genealogy from information in Genesis 12 through 50 that's interspersed with all the stories that we know about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph. You can get how old Abraham was when he died, how old Isaac was when he died, how old Jacob was when he died, and how old Joseph was when he died. It's clear that the author of Genesis is trying to extend the genealogies through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.
Interesting enough about
Um,
genealogies is
and
that,
so he has a problem.
well, I was going to say, the interesting thing about the genealogies is that you can actually compare them with other genealogies there are in the Bible, that Craig would agree that is historical narrative, like Genesis 25 and Genesis or First Chronicles 1, that has genealogies too, and the style that of the literature is the same on the other genealogies.
And that's why I think he has to admit that Genesis 1 through 11 has this quote unquote historical interest. And he does. I think if it weren't for the genealogies, Craig would be comfortable saying that Genesis 1 through 11 is complete fable, that it's completely made up. Like it's some kind of story that has some kind of moral to it, sort of like Jesus's parables. Uh, but because of the genealogies, he's forced to say that there's some kind of historical interest in the author. But it's very unclear what he thinks that is, unless you're going to analyze his own view according to modern science. That's the only lens that I can use to make sense of Craig's view. Is what is he like? It looks for all the world that he just went to the text and was like, I got to figure out a way that this is compatible with the modern scientific histories of the world or claims about history.
Yeah,
And he just
that was one of the things
did as good a job as he could.
right. And that's one of the things whenever I start to read Craig's book, it's almost hard to follow him sometimes because he cites scholars a lot, and he just kind of bounces back and forth. It's like, what's he saying here? Like one place, like early on in the book, he starts talking about the documentary hypothesis. When he first starts out, he says the so-called documentary hypothesis, but he acts like he actually accepts that. And so it's like, okay, does he believe in the documentary hypothesis, or is he just granting it because it's part of literary criticisms? What's going on here?
I mean, I think I remember what he said about the documentary hypothesis, which is just the hypothesis that at least the Pentateuch was written by four different sources,
I think
JEDP sources, I think.
I think he was operating under
What's
the.
that?
I was going to say that I think he says after. I mean, he talks about the documentary hypothesis, but he says that what's relevant to this subject of Genesis 1 and 2, he says that it would be like, what was it? Was it J and J? I know it's not E. J and uh P, I think, maybe. I can't remember. Um, but J,
Yeah, I don't remember either.
but it's like
I
the
all
he adopted the two sources from those four sources when he was talking about it. But I don't know whether or not if he actually believes it or if he's just granting it the way he says it.
I think what he believes is some version of the documentary hypothesis. He doesn't accept the classical standard version of it, which is the JEDP sources. But he says he thinks that something like it is probably true, but he doesn't seem willing to, or at least able or willing to present a clear version of it. So he just thinks there might be multiple sources, but he doesn't want to stick to a particular view of it.
Like he doesn't want to be dogmatic on it.
So in answer to your question, I think he in general accepts something like the documentary hypothesis in that it comes from different sources, but he is not sure or willing to or have he doesn't have some argument for a specific account of that, right?
Right.
So he would probably criticize the classic documentary hypothesis and say it's probably not right because of this, that, and the other thing, but something like it is probably right. It's just, I don't know what it is,
Right.
probably is what his view is.
Right. Something we haven't talked about yet, I mean, we hinted at with marriage, but what is in terms of the New Testament writers' treatment of Genesis past as historical? What does Craig say about that in terms of because the New Testament writers obviously no, I think I do know one place. He does actually acknowledge the fact that if they mention the genealogies, like you see in Matthew and Luke, where they mention genealogies, he does think that the reference to their names do mean it's historical. But how how does he address other things in the New Testament that treats things like the flood, for example, as historical because Jesus compares the flood to the rapture, to the very event at the end of the world, and he compares that to the flood. And of course, I think you mentioned on Donnie's channel as well on chapter 3 of Peter, of I think First Peter, if it's I'm not mistaken, where he talks about the flood, and he's very explicit on that.
Yeah, so Craig's general approach to references like that in the New Testament is to say that they're probably what he calls illustrative rather than assertoric references. And he makes the distinction between um, like a literary reference where you would reference a fictional story for the moral of the story rather than actually asserting that the story actually really happened. Right. So when in like the Olivet discourse that you talked about, where he compares Noah and the flood to the end of the world or something, Craig would probably try to say that, um, well, that flood story didn't actually happen. But what Jesus is saying is that the end of the world will be like it was in the flood story. And he would probably say that that's not asserting the historicity of the flood story.
But the
Um,
interesting thing is that,
Similarly,
go ahead.
uh, he would have a similar response, I think, to the Jesus's talk about marriage and male and female in the beginning. Um, is that if Jesus was referencing the Genesis story, it was a illustrative reference. So, like, if I were modern environmentalists are just like Thanos because they want to kill off a whole bunch of people to save the whales or whatever, right? I would be making an illustrative reference. And the point of the reference is that they're evil, just like this villain in the story. But I would not be, by making that reference, asserting that Thanos actually existed, and the Marvel movie actually happened historically, right? That's what he would say.
Yeah,
Now,
but
as for the second Peter reference, um, in that case, I think he has a problem because the way that the reference is made is in the middle of an argument that Peter is making. And it's very similar to the same reasons that he accepts prove the historicity of Adam and Eve in passages like 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 5. So in those passages, he says Paul is asserting the historicity of Adam. And the reason he gives is from another New Testament commentator named Douglas Moo. And it's that uh, if Adam and Eve never really existed, then Paul's argument in those passages just doesn't make any sense. Because Paul is arguing in Romans 5, for example, that sin entered the world through one man and death through sin. If that didn't actually historically happen, why is Christ required to literally historically come and save us from our sin, right? And it makes a similar argument about 1 Corinthians 15, which is more about the resurrection of the body, right? Where he's talking about the perishable body versus the imperishable. And why does he compare Adam as the ultimate or penultimate example of the perishable body with Christ giving us this imperishable body? If Adam's perishable body wasn't real, and we're trying to claim that Christ's imperishable body and our glorified bodies that we'll share in at the resurrection are not real, like that seems to be a problem, right? If you're saying it's perishable versus imperishable, one is real, historical, and the other one is not, couldn't you then claim then that he thinks of the resurrection as some kind of fable, right? Or illustrative purpose, just like the rest. So he makes these arguments for Adam and Eve in reference to those passages. But when it comes to Second Peter 3, Peter is doing something very similar with the flood. There are people who are saying, or who are doubting that the end of the world is going to happen because, hey, since the beginning, everything has gone on the way it has already gone on. There's never been any huge thing that happens, that changes everything. Like, so it's just going to keep going. And Peter says, no, you forget the flood that destroyed the whole earth. That happened. And as a result of that, we can say, look, sometimes apocalyptic events do occur, like the end of the world. And so Peter is directly comparing the flood to the end of the world. And if he's doing what Craig thinks he is there, that he's saying, well, the flood is this like illustrative reference. It didn't really happen. Then it's not evidence that the end of the world is going to happen.
Right.
It's
That's what I'm
actually
saying.
it would be evidence that Peter thought the end of the world was mythical, right?
Same thing is also true with flood and rapture. It'd be like, hey, here's this real event, but to illustrate the point, let's talk about an event that didn't actually happen. So it wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It's like Jesus rooting marriage. He's saying, "Hey, look, because remember, if you know, remember the context of Jesus referring to marriage, people were using the writing of divorcement issued by Moses as an excuse to divorce their wives for any reason." And he's like, "No, except for adultery, you shouldn't do that." And he said, "Well, yeah, but Moses." He issued writing endorsement. And he said, "Yeah, that's because of hardening of your hearts." But from the beginning, it was not so. So he roots his entire teaching in the reality of how marriage was established in Genesis 2. And so this is how God actually established marriage. And so it's like, okay, you can't get something non-historical out of that without assuming that it would mess up everything that Jesus was saying. Jesus had to assume the historical reality of that event to ground it like that.
Yeah, I would agree.
All right. All right. Moving on. We talked about Neanderthals. Homo heidelbergensis. Why does he think that? I know that he dated. You mentioned earlier that he dates it earlier or dates it later or further back than what Hugh Ross dates Heidelbergensis or humans itself. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was his basis for thinking that Adam is Heidelbergensis? Do you know?
It has mostly to do with archaeological and paleontological evidence, which he details in the second part of the book. So I don't remember specifics about Homo heidelbergensis, but he talks about artifacts that have been found that show that they made tools, things like they buried their dead, artwork that indicates at least rudimentary language, things like that. And so he thinks these things are all features that would only apply to real humans, meaning conscious, fully human people. And so he thinks that this archaeological and ontological evidence pushes way back the origin of what he would consider rational, conscious, image-bearing human. Um, so yeah, that's one of the things that we would probably just agree with him on, except for the dating of it.
Right. The dating of it would be incorrect. It would be based on, is it based on dating methods or is it based on what he thinks that it should be dated?
I'm sure it's based on mainstream dating methods. Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's been a long one. I can see you're already getting tired. So we're gonna do the final question here. Give us some concluding thoughts on theistic evolutionary claims of denying Genesis 1 to 11 as history or historical narrative to leave us with. Do you see other reasons at work here for theistic evolutionists like John Walton, other motivations, that Rimland Craig or Joshua Swamidass, etc., to be real, their motivation for them to deny the straightforward teaching of the historicity of Genesis 1 to 11. Do you think that, I mean, obviously we want to be careful not to make a circumstantial ad hominem fallacy here, but do you think that there's an underlying reason why they are really big about denying the historicity of Genesis 1 to 11? Is it like we talked about them being afraid. I think Craig himself even admitted that there's a fear that's corresponding with the idea of young Earth creation being true, and people that really don't want to believe that that's the case. Do you see that there's a connection here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the primary motivation of all of these interpretations is because they think that modern science tells us the truth about the history of the world, and the Bible cannot be in conflict with that, and so they have to change what the Bible means. They have to change their interpretation of the Bible. And they are motivated to do that because of science. Now, they will claim to high heaven that's not what they're doing. But I've studied some of the history of different views on Genesis, and nobody did that until modern science gave us a reason to. And a lot of times, old earthers will even admit this, right? They'll say, if you show them all this evidence that I've compiled from before that about ancient authors like Augustine and Origen and Irenaeus that you mentioned, I have a bunch of others like Hippolytus of Rome, Theophilus of Antioch, clear smoking gun references that show they were young earthers and believe the biblical chronology. Sometimes old earthers will respond to me and say, well, of course they believe that. They didn't have modern science available. They didn't have scientific reasons to doubt that, you know. And so they can't turn around and then say out of the other side of their mouth, well, when I interpret the Bible, I'm not doing so because of modern science. Um, uh,
I've
and
actually heard
it's
an inspiring philosopher. Yeah, you know Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. He would say that like the church fathers, he would admit, and we're going to talk. I'll mention this in a second because I know Craig does actually admit this as well. That the church fathers actually did take a young Earth interpretation like this, and none of them actually held an old Earth interpretation. But Michael Jones would say that they were using the information that they had available at the time, kind of thing. Which I'm not exactly sure what he means by that exactly. Is he saying that, hey, look, they were ignorant of science, that's why they hold this position? That's what it sounds like he's saying. Craig actually does admit that church fathers also hold this position. If I'm not mistaken, he does actually admit that the church or that people didn't start a lot in the church start believing this until roughly around the 1800s. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if he's admitted it, but it is correct. So, uh, yeah. So the thing about if they were only using the text and they came to this conclusion, to me, that's how you're supposed to interpret texts. You're not supposed to use information that the authors themselves did not have to understand what the authors meant. They could not have meant anything to do with a modern scientific claim because they just didn't know anything about that. Okay, so we have an option here. Are we going to interpret the text according to what the ancient authors meant and understood the text to mean, like we do with every other text? If so, you have a choice. You're either a young earth creationist or you have to deny the inspiration or the at least the inerrancy of the text. Okay? And we can do that with everything else, right? With the Greek myths, I can just say, well, no, of course that didn't happen, right? But if you're going to hold to the Bible as God's word, that's his divinely inspired and inerrant word, you can't do that with the text. And they know this, right? And so they come up with these alternative interpretations that no one would use in any other situation with any other text. Okay. It's an inconsistent position. So, and I think we know why. We talked about this already, but it bears repeating that Craig implicitly gets his truth about the history of the universe, the history of the world, the history of the earth, the history of life on earth from modern scientific claims about it. And he thinks that can't be denied. It's the truth. And so he reinterprets Genesis. And I think that he's literally making it a myth by doing that, right? It's not really a myth in the sense Craig means it. I can accept it's a historical myth or a true myth the way Lewis meant it, but it's not really a myth in the way Craig means it. Um, but he's making it that because I think this, I like to end with this quote from the book because I think this is really just as revealing as all this other stuff. He says, when reality in the world comes into conflict with myth, what's the reality? The reality we're getting from science. When reality in the world comes into conflict with myth, it is myth that must and does change. Um, so it depends on what you think the reality is. If you get the reality from the Bible, you don't need to change anything. You need to change science, right? It's science that is the myth that must change when it comes into conflict with the Bible. But he wants to say that science is the reality, and when the Bible comes into conflict with science, the Bible has to change.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much. I know this has been a long one, but it's been great having you on here. Thank you again. We appreciate what you did. I'm gonna link your resources in the description box below for anyone to check out your material. And thank you for joining us on here and having this discussion with us. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for having me on. It was a fun time, Brian. I wish you all the best.
You too. God bless. Thank you for watching Apologetics 101 today and joining us in this discussion about William Lane Craig's book and reviewing that. I know we've done one before on the Genesis series with Simon Turpin, but it was great having someone new to discuss this, especially someone who has studied this matter for the past 5 years. So this was good having Ben Kissling on here. We had a great conversation. We differed a little bit on some of the ways which we respond to his book, but that's fine. That's fine. But I thought he did a really good job at responding to a lot of these criticisms. We delved into the subjective nature of Craig's criteria. We dug into the broadness of his criteria. We talked about etiologies. We talked about myths and that sort of thing. So I thought this was a great discussion. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do not forget to like the video, share the content with others, subscribe to my channel, please. I got more in store. I've got another episode of Are We Apes that's going to be coming out soon. I've toward the end of November, I've got a interview with Dr. Peter Line on the subject matter of it's not exactly on Neanderthals. It's we're tiling human origins, but we're going to delve really specifically in the reasons for these morphological differences and various finds such as what which will include Neanderthals, but also would include like Homo heidelbergensis that we talked a little bit about today. Um, we didn't delve too much in that because we were mostly centered, like Ben said, for the first half of Craig's book. That was a primary focus, um, and that we were targeting there. Um, and that's what we were focused on today. And we're going to be talking more about like Heidelbergensis and Homo erectus and things like that when I do my interview with Peter Line, because we're going to really delve into specifics involving that. And so I can't wait for my interview with Dr. Peter Line. I think he's going to be bringing a presentation for us. So it's going to be cool. So stay tuned for that. Make sure you hit the notification bell to be notified of all future videos because we've got others in store. Thank you for watching today, and God bless. And as I always say, stay in the know.